I'd like to hear that. That might be a good start. I mean, what
Okay.
bothers you before we've even started?
Okay. So what
Well,
bothers us about cycles? So this week we're going to be doing cycles.
And
yeah.
yeah,
Go for it, Len.
Well, cycles are, there are plenty of examples of cycles. There aren't a lot of descriptions of what the process of a cycle is. There's not a lot of, like you can read tons of stuff about self-organization and feedback and all these things and about what they are and how the features and the functions of them and all of that, and you can dig it out in cycles. It's kind of like everybody gets what a cycle is, so you intuitively see what it is. So yeah, I have to sit down and actually define the features and the functions, which, by the way, are actually written from classes from 15 years ago with Len, which is, I dug up some of that, but there's not much. It's sketchy. So it's kind of a pain to write about. The other things are easier. It's just a pain because I have to do it, They're all, none of them are easy, but cycles for some reason I guess because it's so damn obvious. And and everybody goes, yeah, that's a cycle. It goes around and around, or, And then there's the other problem is it doesn't necessarily go around and end up in the same place.
Mm.
There's oscillations, right? And then there's cycles not really coming back to the same place, but it's the same thing going around again. I mean, it gets a little tricky for definition. It's not as easy like, okay, this is positive feedback, it's just tricky for me.
Great.
Interesting, huh?
and let me ask Lynn one question while she's on the spot here, leading us off. So feedback is a kind of a cycle,
Of
too.
course. Yeah, it is a cycle.
Does that bother you?
Yes.
Also?
Yes, it does. And feedback, yeah. Cycles are made up of feedbacks also somewhat, maybe. It's really, yeah, Len, what do you think?
Well, I don't think feedback are cycles. I think they're distinct.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of problem with cycles, like you have cycles, hypercycles, recursions, oscillations, life cycles, waves, solitons. I include spin. There's all kinds of waves. There's all kinds of solitons. Life cycles are different from cycles because, as the engineers have pointed out, in most cycle cases, the thing ends up going through the stages over and over again. But in life cycles, you and I, for example, if we know our life cycle or a market life cycle or any species life cycle, you go through the same stages. So I put them in cycles, but there's not a continuation of the same thing unless you believe in the Eastern concept of what is that when a person reappears. Reincarnation, yeah. So, and solitons are special types of waves, and I'm the only one who includes spin in there because, in fact, I have a slide on that right here. How are they all the same isomorph? And I go over cycles, hypercycles, recursions, oscillations, life cycles, waves, and solitons, and look at them and say, well, are they the same or are they different? I put them all under the lump.
You can share your screen, Len, if you want to.
What's that?
You can share your screen if you'd like to, Len.
Oh, I'd have to figure out how to do that.
There's the share screen. If you just move your mouse, you can see share screen at the bottom.
Yeah, but I don't even see you guys on Zoom. What happened? Oh, well.
Now you have to press, I'll let Gary direct this.
You can do Alt Tab to bring back the Zoom screen. Maybe you've moved off the Zoom screen.
Alt Tab doesn't work on my Mac machine.
Oh dear.
And I reduced the size of the let's see, I reduced the size of the, where did it go? Where did you guys all go?
Well, we
I had
can
all
still
your
see
pictures
you.
on there and now I don't have it.
You might not be on Zoom. You might have clicked on something, another application or somewhere else on your screen. Does it say Zoom at the top?
I've got a big screen that says Zoom right here, but it doesn't show
So
me anything.
if you've got a Mac, go down to your dock, click the Zoom icon, because sometimes I get off and I click the Zoom icon and it should put you back onto your current meeting. It's a little blue thing with a like a movie camera.
On it. Yes, I've done it and it doesn't do it.
If you click on it,
Try going up to view on next to Zoom
okay.
and see what's showing up for you there.
You know, in the past, I've been able to do that.
Yeah.
I don't know why it's not working now.
We're still seeing and hearing you.
Oh, yeah, so I'm still on Zoom.
Yes, you definitely are.
And what do you see?
I see a little picture of you when you speak up, Tyler, in the upper left-hand corner and a big screen that says Big Zoom on it, but it doesn't say what Zoom, it doesn't show all your pictures like it did before.
In that picture, so when the person speaks, can you hover over that and see anything which allows you to expand that into full screen?
Yeah, were you just
Oh,
seeing?
yes, that worked. That worked. So now I have you guys on.
Right.
And
Okay.
that allows me to go to share screen.
That's right. Yes.
Okay, so you see the share screen now?
Not yet. You need
No,
to
you have to-
press it.
You have to press on your image that you want to show.
Well, is it showing now?
Wait, but do you have what application is your image in?
Is it show now?
No.
Doggone it.
What application is your image in? Is it in an
It's in
Adobe?
PowerPoint.
So when you go to share screen, do you see a screen and it says PowerPoint? You can't just switch to PowerPoint. You've got to do it through Zoom.
Okay, so I've got to get back to Zoom now, and I've lost you on Zoom. How did I get you last time? Oh, you're back now. So I see you guys.
Well, maybe because I think I'd like to share a screen too. Because even though Len said he's got this image, I thought maybe I could just spend 5 minutes going through some of the images in that chapter of mine. Oh, there. Okay, there he is. There is. Okay,
You made
good.
it.
Good. The threat that I was going to take over
Yeah.
got Len to click the right thing.
This is exactly
Oh.
why I'm having a hard time with, I don't even want to look at this. I don't want to get into solitons and spin. I just know nothing about solitons and spin. And I know that it's a sinkhole of learning that I just can't even look at.
Well, the nice thing about cycles is there's a number of, besides identifying features, there's a number of measurables that are important, like the oscillation period itself, which is the way the geologists and the astronomers describe a cycle, for example.
Yeah.
And
Well,
but I found that when I talk with the engineers, they didn't like my oscillations at all because they think in terms of other kinds of oscillations. So I think in terms of oscillations like the predator-prey cycle and going around a carrying capacity, and I see positive and negative feedbacks are involved in making oscillations, and they don't see that at all because their mathematics doesn't look at it that
I
way.
like it, Len. I'm an engineer. I like what you're talking about as oscillation.
Well, thank you, Gary. I'll refer to you, except for one engineer that I know.
So I get all of these apart from, so hypercycles I don't get. I'm not familiar with that, and solitons I'm not familiar with. Maybe if everybody is interested, could you just give a little brief? Is everybody else happy with cycles, recursions, oscillations, life cycle waves, and spin?
Well, what I'm not happy with on this diagram is that cycles is supposed to be the isomorph.
Mm,
And so, but in this list, it's as if it's one example.
mm,
But I think Len really means that everything below cycles is a sub kind
mm,
of the isomorph cycle. Is that right, Len?
Yes, that's correct, Tyler. And in fact, in my lumper splitter lists, I put cycles once, but I put all of these subheadings underneath cycles.
mm,
Okay, and yeah, and the hypercycle is the what's his name? The Origin of Life guy,
Manfred
Len.
Eigen.
Yeah, Manfred Eigen. This is the pre-living cell chemical cycles, sort of proto-cell cycles. This is Manfred Eigen's. It's chemical enzymes, or it's not to be limited to enzymes, but chemical A makes chemical B makes C, C makes D, and these chemicals are in auto
Autocatalysis.
catalytic loops. So thanks, George.
Right.
So that would be actually a chemical cycle. And all of these recursions, I mean, oscillation is used in is physics, but it could be used in politics. I mean, it depends on how you define it.
yes.
It's used. You could talk about political oscillations. So all these would have to be gone into. I mean, we could start lumping these as physical, biological, and cultural too, which is a different way of lumping, Len, right?
Well, if Hillary Slittle was here, you would say, "Oh, I see. So sometimes they're restricted to a particular scalar level," and that's what he, suggested in one of his diagrams.
And spin, Len, I assume you're talking about spin as the quantum mechanical spin, not a skating ice dancer spin.
No, we don't spin, but some planets spin, some moons spin,
Yeah.
Some galaxies spin.
Okay, rotate.
Angular momentum everywhere. So subatomic particles spin. I define spin as due to heterogeneity of the object within a field.
Okay, so that does include skating. Okay.
It could, but it's a trivial example because the most spin, one of the interesting questions, and sometimes general systems ideas actually require reductionists to start doing some new research, which is very interesting because they think we're non-scientific. But in the case of spin, they've never asked the question, why do things spin? And how does the spin maintain itself? And it's due to the field around it, not to the thing that's spinning, I think.
And Len, where does the global carbon cycle fit here? Where does the global nitrogen cycle fit? What about the thermal halide circulation of the ocean? The ocean goes to deep to the surface. Are hurricanes in here?
Yes, they're all in there, and they're all under the idea of oscillations. Basically.
Oscillations. What about the carbons? Okay, so hurricanes would be under oscillations. What about the
So
the
biogeochemical cycles are one of the prime examples of cycles. And the biogeochemical cycles are already transdisciplinary. That's why they call them biogeochemical.
And where so are they not in this current list?
Yes, they are.
Where?
In fact, I discussed them under cycles.
Oh, yeah, but to put you on the spot a little bit, which I love doing, as you know, cycles is the isomorph. So, but you're not claiming that the 7 underneath that are the main 7 are the main 7 classes of cycles. They happen to be arbitrary 7 that you've thought of.
No, they're not arbitrary. They are the 7 alternative forms of cycling.
Man, I have problems.
The major isomorph has a lot of subsets to it, as you said before,
right?
That are pertinent to look into.
Yeah. So, but then where are the global biogeochemical cycles? Where the
Then that's under cycles in that first step.
Yeah, but this is
Yeah.
driving me nuts.
Yeah, so
Driving me crazy.
I think what Tyler
Well,
is
that's
getting
good.
at,
It's
if
driving Lynn crazy
Yeah.
too. I try to drive as many people crazy as possible.
See,
mission accomplished.
Wait, Lynn, go ahead. Yeah,
A big success
I'm
for
not
the day.
letting I'm not letting Len off the spot here so easily.
what to take it back, what we need are the basic features and functions of cycles. And
Exactly.
then how do hypercycles, recursions, oscillations, waves, life cycle, all of that stuff, how do they demonstrate those features and functions?
Okay, so I think I've
That's
worked
how
this out.
That's the only way I can get to this stuff.
Okay, let me try it out. Let me try out something kind of spur of the moment, but it's any parameter that if you map it in time, repeats. And it doesn't mean everything about a system repeats. I mean, even a skater going around doesn't repeat exactly. But if you define the parameter as, let's say, an arm in a certain spatial spot in relation to others, it's going to change and it's going to return to it. And that's all. That's the meta pattern of the cycle. Anytime that happens, you have a meta pattern of a cycle. And what I and
Let me
spin
jump in
it.
here and say that the only way to prove an isomorphy is to see it in lots of different scalar levels, which I've shown for cycles, and show it in a lot of different phenomena. But then also to test that by going through your ID features. Think of an M by N matrix where the features are, let's say, in the left end, the X column, and Y is all the different cases. And then you're able to check off the identifying features and functions across all of the examples. And that's the only way to show an isomorphy, in my humble opinion. But, you know, it's not been done for all of them. It's not been done for all of these for cycles.
What do you mean, all of these? What's the these you're referring to?
The 7 subsets that you see here.
Well, we all agree
8
that
subsets.
these are examples of cycles.
Hmm.
But Len, you keep talking about the I gotta try to get to the bottom of this, because logically you've got the 7 as subsets of cycles, and yet anything that's not in those subsets you say is an example of a cycle, like the biogeochemical cycle.
No, the biogeochemical is under cycles.
Yeah, but which of the 7?
Because,
Or
should
is
I
there
show you the
something else?
slide of the identifying features and functions?
Gary
perhaps?
gets it.
Yes,
Gary,
thank you.
Can I just ask? So if we identify something which is a cycle but doesn't fit into those 7, then what is it?
It's another isomorphy if it's across all disciplines and scalar levels. But
oh man, Len, you're
I have
on.
other slides that show the identifying features are shared in some cases by
So
a couple of
So
isomorphies.
when is a
not-
cycle not a cycle?
Okay, Tom's got his hand up.
Then, not to be a broken record, but the first thing that comes to my mind is this badly needs to be quote model that is carefully defined. And I think Tyler said something very important, that these are subtypes of cycle. So we need to have a generalization, specialization hierarchy. Initially just 2 levels, but it could very easily go to more levels. And we need to carefully define the generalization, which I think is what cycles is supposed to be, and then the subtypes of it, and make sure that all the definitions are coherent. That is, they all fit together. They don't they're not inconsistent. And that's a whole process to do that. So we would initially have some definitions based on what Len showed, but it could very easily change as we start looking into it very carefully and making sure that it's coherent. So I think that's the kind of process we need to go through. And I've gone through that in other things, and it tends to work, but it takes time and effort.
Okay, thanks, Tom. George?
Yeah, so I'm listening and trying to absorb and everything else. A lot of this stuff has already been worked out. It's called dynamical systems. And the notion of here is that we have numerous phenomena, the dynamics of which indicate that they go through periodic re-entry of states. If it's an ergodic system, then you plan to get back to a certain state at some point in time. And the dynamics, what Tyler said a little bit earlier, I mean, you're basically looking at something evolving in time. So it's going through either a periodic or aperiodic kind of cycling. But all of this is already sort of worked out. All I think we're saying is that in all scales, what we're seeing is an isomorphic phenomena that takes place in these. And so rather than calling them isomorphies, I go back to something I said a long time ago, which is that maybe there's a little shift of semantics here. That things are isomorphic across scales is one thing, but to identify them as things in of themselves which is what the term isomorphies or anisomorphy sort of indicates. And I'm still not totally comfortable with that kind of semantics. So they are isomorphic. And you can see everything from, I mean, one of my favorite ones is strange attractor dynamics in phase space. You see some beautiful non-repeating, that is, they're aperiodic cycles and so forth. But like I say, I'm not sure that we're productively arguing about this because it's something that's been well known for a long time.
George, so I agree with the general comment about dynamical systems for when you get into strange attractors, strange loops. But like, how does where would you put something such as a life cycle, the evolution of various life cycles of an organism? Clearly, organisms are dynamical systems, but it wouldn't formally fit into dynamical systems theory as I understand it. It's sort of evolutionary theory. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about a cycle that is a biological cycle that maybe one could talk about is functional for supporting the life of an organism versus the spin of a galaxy.
Well, it's an extremely large state space, right? A living system. And what you're really talking about cycles is not the cycle of the individual organism, but of the germline. That's what goes through cycles. The right. That's the entity that goes on forever, so to speak.
Well, if we take the simple example of the famous butterfly, that it is the germline, but also we could say that the form of that organism, it's extended over several lifetimes of not that organism, but of that species. The butterfly as, again, something in a parameter space, a shape in a parameter space that you can define as, winged, and it has certain feeding habits, as opposed to the caterpillar, as opposed to the egg part of that species life cycle. And this is getting at what I would say to answer Lynn's question, that if you say roughly egg, caterpillar, pupa, or chrysalis for the butterfly, and then the butterfly itself, a 4-phase life cycle. Every single butterfly is somewhat different, but what we can distinguish as a butterfly phase is repeatedly entered into as
Yeah.
various generations go along.
Yeah, but that's why I get back to state spaces. It's a huge, huge state space, but it's a semi-ergodic system, meaning that it expects to go through the same state space, right? The same position in state space periodically,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's and
Guys are
dynamical
ignoring the
systems.
identifying features of cycles, which describe all of those things, but they distinguish them from state spaces. I'm sorry, George.
What?
Cycles are different from state spaces.
No, it's a cycle through state space. That's the definition of an ergodic system.
Can we go through the identifying features, which are shown as 12 symbols here? But
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not confident of them.
Go for it, Len.
You know, everything is research. The first of all, you recognize cycles because there's stages in it. And that's my icon for stages.
That's very similar to what George and I were just saying, I think.
Steps, there's steps in a process. May seem like a smooth transition. I actually can't see my own thing here because your pictures are interfering with it. Okay, now I can see it. So what did I say there? I don't know how to go back.
Stages. There's stages.
The other thing is important is there's an obligate sequence. You can't change the sequence. It won't do that. So there's an obligate sequence in the transformations of one stage into the next. That's because the next stage usually requires the previous stage to be set up and finished before you can get to the next stage. The return to beginning is in just some of the cycles. It's not in all of them. And then there's the case of oscillations, which are periodic, and whatever it is goes through the same stages, but continues to go through those stages. So the other icons are the initiating conditions can be very important and affect the overall cycle. A cycle may seem like a smooth transition, but it's not. It's got very specific intermediates. The control of stages is an element which we found for the cell cycle, which was very important, and there's lots of controls. This is where feedback comes in because there's a lot of feedback required in order to get the cycle. That is when one stage starts and one stage ends. This is the source for embedding cycles in a net context for a function. And then there's entrainment of all the cycles. That's what's shown by that particular icon. Let's look at the population of humans or look at the population of water molecules that are in the water biogeochemical cycle or the oxygen biogeochemical cycle. There has to be entrainment of all of the elements in the population, which can be, you know, as you can see, trillions and trillions. And then there's a periodicity that's measurable, which is the oscillation and return to the same point in the oscillation, which can be also true for spin. And then I had a spinning thing here, and I asked the question again, what continues the angular momentum? Something has to drive it, and scientists are very happy to say that certain bosons and hadrons and so on have half spin or full spin or 1.5 spin, and that's how you distinguish them. But they never address the question of why do they keep spinning? What is the energy which causes them to spin? And that's an important thing. So those are my 12 identifying features by which I would then challenge every specific example and see if they had all of those. Oh, there's the spinning angular momentum. And things the size of galaxies and things as the size of subatomic particles. That's about 40 log levels of length, all show the spinning. And then I go to each one in this lecture, which I won't bother you with. And why stages are important, for example, to Alzheimer's disease and progeria diseases and so on. Well,
Wow.
thank you for listening. So
Wow.
that's been one of my lectures for about this for the isomorphy cycles. But then there's a bunch of, I have 15 identifying functions here. For other ones I have, like hierarchy, I have something like 35. And then I go through, so here on cycles, I have the biogeochemical cycles that I usually talk about.
Yeah.
Just to satisfy you, Tyler, if you can
Yes.
possibly be satisfied.
Yeah.
It's tough,
And
I
then
know.
I talk about spin as a conditional example of cycles, but where is my picture of, and I don't have it in this one apparently, of how identifying features can be common between a couple of isomorphies, and I thought Lynn would like that, but she hasn't seen these slides, not all of them anyway. And Tyler, this is an important one. So each case study of a phenomenon at a particular level, case study 100 it says here, should look at identifying features 1, 2, and 3 and see how many X's you can accumulate in all those. And that's, I think, what Marzoff was saying in terms of modeling it, you have to do a lot more work. Yeah, I agree with that. But Tyler liked all of these examples of cycles in physics and chemistry and in geology and in biology and in computer science and in mathematics and so on. And in human systems. I have 73 or so here, but there's probably a lot more than that.
Wow.
And then because you know what cycles do, you can start talking about a pathology of cycles. Why things go wrong, and then I have the bibliography, and then I have the general systems life cycle, which most of you don't know anything about, and so on. I'm done. Sorry.
Wow. No, don't, yeah, no, wow. Wow. I didn't know you had, I don't know, did other people know Len had this huge lecture on cycles?
Yeah, I knew there was a good bit. Not all that, perhaps.
I've seen
But
some of that before.
Actually, I have about a dozen lectures like this for the different isomorphies in
Right.
my course on introducing systems engineers to system science. So I have 90-minute lectures, of which this is just one.
I keep thinking of, I think it was Korzybski, the general semantics guy, who talked about concepts being different per person and per time because they change. So I keep saying this definition of cycles as a Len Troncalli version. And each of us probably has our own. And there may be a George Mobus version as well. The only way we can get these all together is to actually document them in some type of a model and agree on what distinctions are important to us. Otherwise, we're not really communicating on a lot of this. And Len obviously has a wealth of insight here and knowledge, but it needs to be put in my understanding into a different form.
Yeah, I'd love to kind of peer review Len's work. He's gone beyond what I did in my chapter on cycles, in which I was looking at the phenomenon of cycles. I try to distinguish between cycles in physical space and cycles in property space. As I said, I lumped in feedbacks because to me feedbacks have a cyclic nature to them, but Len brought up the fact, and George brought it up, that the feedbacks often correspond, let's say inside a cell, feedbacks are corresponding to metabolic loops in terms of proteins opening up genes to be transcribed and then making more proteins, and these are all being regulated by concentrations. So there's a a kind of a merging of feedback and some of these more physical or chemical cycles. Um, I also I also bring in metaphor. So contemplating the cycles can make one's head spin, and so and the way that shamans may use repetition of drumming to get into certain mental states. I mean that's a whole nother avenue, is exploring cycles in the human world, not just mechanical cycles. Like I give examples of of, um, of state changes in power plants that we've used to control cycles, but then there's also examples in well, I brought up political cycles, and I the one thing, I think there's a relationship between cycles and dualities, or I call them binaries, that many cycles, they don't have to be binary, but many of them are, particularly in the way that, like if you're if you're canoeing, you got a stroke in the water and then you're out of the water and you're returning the stroke. So often many things are kind of two stroke, but they don't have to be. Just that I think many of them are, because it's the simplest way to have complexity. I mean, I can think of the metazoan, the multicellular life cycle is oscillating between the single cell phase and a multi-cell, that the genotype that grows up to then produce the single cell again. It's always going through this funnel. I mean, that relates to Len's idea of a return or an origin or key points. I mean, I agree. I'd have to go through all those one by one, Len, but it was super rich in terms of stages. I did want to ask you.
May I interrupt you,
Yes,
Tyler?
yes,
and
yes,
say
yes,
something?
yes.
I've been reading your Meta Patterns book, and your Meta Patterns book is essentially an isomorphic book as far as I'm concerned.
Yes.
I mean, it has some differences, but it's basically, and that's why the engineers and the discussions in INCOSE caused me to change SPT to SP to the third T, because they said, oh, some of yours aren't processes. And that's true. Some of them are just patterns. And some of them are pathologies. And so it's SP3T, really. And so anyway, I wanted to compliment you, Tyler, for foreseeing and looking across disciplines. But I want to warn all of you that you're still people who look across disciplines. Peter Tuttenham and Luke Frenchu and Lynn also listened to the virtual conference, International Conference on Complex Systems, out of NEXI. It's not really out of NEXI anymore, but it's independent. It's a bunch of scientists, and it's much more rigorous than ISSS, I think. However, they commented, all three of them independently commented, oh, really what they're talking about is SPT, but they haven't discovered it yet, and they don't cite you, which is true. I think they only concentrate on their disciplines, just like Santa Fe Institute does. They're still more rigorous, but they concentrate only on the 1 or 2 or 3 disciplines that they cover. And as a result, they're blinded from the transdisciplinary nature, which this group and the ISSS is devoted to. So they may be more rigorous than ISSS, but they limit themselves. So anyway, your Meta Patterns was a foreseeing of all that.
I love this. I think the cycles are such a great example. A nod to nod to people who into borders too. I think boundaries is a great example also. But the cycles, to go back to what Lynn started saying, that in some sense it's so simple. What the hell? But because it's so simple and everybody can sort of admit, like, oh yeah, I use the word cycle, and yeah, there's cycles out there. But what I like,
well, I do recycling of my trash, you know.
Yeah. But what I like, Len has gone farther than I have seen in trying to spell out properties of cycles as an isomorph. And I'd love to try to review all those things because and maybe there should be a paper on. I mean, Len, you never published a paper on this, did you, on cycles? I mean, that stuff is on your
I
slide.
did one
Is
on
it-
duality, which you'd be interested in because it was on duality. And you're interested
Yeah,
in
but the
duality.
cycles. I mean, you've got this enormous PowerPoint.
Well,
I
I
mean,
have these,
George would have so much to contribute, as you know, and Tommy. We
right.
all. I
In
mean,
fact, I require George Mobus's book for my students, and
this
I
whole.
teach again in spring, so it'll be offered again in spring. And Peter Tuddenham went through all 30 hours of the lectures to
But
understand, and 12 of them are 90-minute lectures on the different isomorphies I fit.
your cycles lecture is not up on the web, is it, Len?
It could be. It's already available.
Because
If I give you the Cultura, I think it's the Cultura designation for it. But I have to enter you into the course.
because it's so interesting. I'd have to go into. I mean, yes, thank you. You've got the biogeochemical cycles in there, but if you all don't, if you just bear with me for a second, everybody, I just want to push Len just a bit. He started off with his first property. He's got the 12. The 12 are really fascinating, but but spin and oscillation started slipping in there as something separate and yet similar. So I think we need to push the logic on this. So the first thing you said, Len, was that it has stages. And that relates very much, I'm very much with that in a sense, because if those stages can be defined logically and linguistically, mathematically, whatever, and you can say it's moved, at minimum, the cycle is binary. You have to have one, it has to move away from it and back to it. So that's where I think duality comes in as kind of not every cycle has to be binary, but at minimum, you have to be in state A, go to state B, and go back to state A as minimum. However, here's what I want to ask you. The spin, the Earth going around the sun, you don't call that a cycle because it doesn't have stages, correct?
That's a good point.
Thanks.
Well, any spin of an object, like angular momentum, doesn't have stages per se either.
Correct.
So, and then that's the exercise that you would go through all the different examples you have at different scalar levels and different disciplines, and ask yourself, does it have all of the features? Then you either change your identifying features,
Yes.
because it's not enough common to all of them, or you change that particular case and you eliminate that case because it doesn't have all the features.
Okay, so I want what we're hearing here, this is because I'm so, I spent a chunk of my life on my chapter on cycles, so I'm really kind of into it. And I continue, and my whole academic career was on the biogeochemical cycles, but then tied into organisms and life cycles within biogeochemistry, and then engineering because human fossil fuel emissions. So I got into the engineering cycles. So I'm really into this. But I think what we just heard is that Len said that his first thing of stages, his first criteria of stages, and I admit it's very powerful, but he said that you said there's a problem with that, because we can have examples that it doesn't fit. George.
Exactly.
So look, I get back to this thing. A state space, everybody's familiar with that concept, right? State space. A
Not
stage
really, George.
could be identified as not identified. A stage could be in those cases of state spaces for which there is some sort of a lingering, if you will, in that particular area. So it doesn't need to have stages per se. All of them, the Earth going around the sun, a spinning top, all of them have a dynamic which is identified by being in states at particular times, if you will. And so whether or not there's a stage involved just simply means, like at the top, we're spinning and it would, every time it went around, it would stop in one particular location for an instant and then continue around. You could call that a stage, I think. But it's not the stage per se. It's the fact that you're going to go through a identifiable set of state spaces over time.
That's the
That's
second
good.
item. The sequence is essential.
Well, okay, now look, so there's another problem. There are aperiodic cycles. That is, they don't repeat. They don't go through exactly the same.
And those attractors are a part of a different isomorphy, and you have to be sensitive to the differences as well as the similarities. This is what drives Lynn crazy, because if I may speak for you, Lynn, I think I've heard you say before, well, all the isomorphies are just one thing. They're all one isomorphy. And that's because there's overlapping identifying features.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't go so far as
I'm
to
glad you're
say
here
that.
to correct me.
I have to correct you there. Thanks, George. I think that was looking at it as state, space, and time, and identifiable sequences in a state space that repeat. I think that's kind of right on. That makes sense to me. Because when I'm looking at, I'm taking notes here, so I have to go back. When I'm looking at stages, I immediately went steps in the process, and I immediately thought, no, because, and then Tyler or somebody mentioned, yeah, but what about the Earth going around the sun? Is that in stages? What about spin? Is that in stages? Yeah, so I think instead of saying stages, let's look at state space in time, identifiable sequences in the state space in time makes sense. Now, what does it mean? It means when network scientists, when Barabasi describes what a cycle is, he says that everything in his world is a network, everything. So if you, just to diverge a little bit, if you spend enough time on a process, everything is that process. Period. I mean, you get deep enough into it, you start viewing the world from that process, right? Because they're all so general. That's the way it starts to work. But I think what he said basically was that in a network, that a cycle is when the links in the nodes basically come back, form a path that comes back to the beginning, that comes back to the original node, kind of.
Barabasi actually, I read
that.
I read one of his books, but he defined it. Okay, he defined it. Okay.
He defines it in network science. He actually defines cycle as that. That's how he defines what cycle is. And I could look it up right now in his new textbook.
There's a complication there as well. He also talks about evolving networks, where you're adding nodes and adding links and so forth, and under some kind of situation. So cycles, in the sense that you return to the same state space, yes, they exist, but they're actually a subset of the larger phenomena. And just to throw a monkey wrench in the whole thing, cycles as thus defined can only occur if the universe is in fact ergodic. And there's a lot of reasons to believe that it's not. Kaufman came to the conclusion years ago that the universe is non-ergodic, which is why evolution occurs. There's always something new. There's always some state that's being added to the state space that wasn't there before.
It never returns to the beginning. It does, nothing ever returns to the beginning. Even the sun going around the I mean, the Earth going around the sun never returns to the beginning, technically.
Yeah. I think
Uh,
the
Well,
Earth is
well, the
gradually
sun,
moving away.
and the sun is moved. The sun is moving.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm.
It's actually a helix. The Earth's path is a
Right.
helix.
Yeah,
But George, if it doesn't return exactly, but does that kill our idea of a cycle? If you define the cycle as exactly, but yet so many things nearly return, or they return if you map the state space generally enough to eliminate the variations, the thing that doesn't, you might have something that didn't repeat, but then you have something that repeats.
Yeah, enough physical phenomena are constrained sufficiently that they appear to be ergodic. In communications theory, we talk about ergodic sources. So a sine wave, for example, which you can readily produce in an electronic circuit, it appears for all practical purposes to repeat itself and come back,
Yeah. But if that were your defining characteristic, that would so limit us, there wouldn't be anything interesting to say. And maybe that's the monkey wrench you want to put into this. But
I'm not trying to introduce a monkey wrench. What I'm trying to point out is that it's a little more complicated than the simple idea of a repeating cycle.
But to me, like, for example, I'll just give one example of when I said cycles are at minimum binary, although they can be unity if they have no discernible break. If you can't easily call them stages, that would be one. That might be one class of cycle that has no discernible stages except for the human mind maybe going on it. But let me give one example of a binary cycle. In the cell, energy cycle, ATP to ADP,
Mm-hmm.
the adding and taking away of the phosphate group that allows a high energy molecule to be formed and then go back to a low energy state and then attach the phosphate to a high energy state again. I mean, this is basically the main energy currency of all cells is a sort of a binary cycle between these two states. Len, are you okay with that too?
Well, I just looked up the definition of ergodic, and I have to disagree with George. I think George is concentrating on the fact that he has chapters that describe dynamics, systems dynamics, and he wants to put everything in those terms, and I do not. So I still stick with the concept of cycles and cycling, but.
See, because the way I see it is that when evolution comes in. So I'm really sorry, Len. We haven't really brought in evolution significantly enough, I think, in this discussion. And so when biological evolution comes in, cycles can be something that get discovered as an isomorph or meta pattern by organisms to help them live. It can be.
They make them more sustainable, make them more efficient, if you will, in capturing energy and keeping it for themselves. That's what all of evolution is capturing energy and keeping it inside yourself.
And then the ATP-ADP is a mechanism for the capturing and using energy that the creatures have. We think that the origin of life probably, the earliest prokaryotic cell would have the ATP-ADP cycle, and maybe the nicotinamide cycle. I mean, I don't want to go into that in detail, and Len, you're more expert at it than I am. But I just wanted to bring in.
What evolution points out is what I think George was saying is that the universe is non-ergodic because it has a direction. And saying it has a direction means that it doesn't always repeat every possible statistical outcome. It kind of directional, and that may be because we're in a entropic universe, and frankly, I don't believe the entropic universe is the only one. In the Wednesday discussion with Peter Tuddenham and Singers and so on, they got me to admit that I was a Platonist. A statement that Plato made. A statement that Plato made is exactly what I say for isomorphies, and that is that the universe keeps spinning off the same system over and over again.
Yes, yes.
Scale.
This is what makes my head spin.
But scientists don't like that because they study a particular set of systems.
No,
and they can't allow that.
No, and once you get your head in this direction, you feel like you've gone off the deep end in terms of
in terms of conventional science.
In terms of
and
conventional science,
all of you are off the deep end. That's for sure. And I say that as a compliment. That's the strange thing. But I have to go back to something George said, and it actually came out in Cancun when I was at an ISSS meeting, and instead of going to the plenary sessions, which were by some guru who was spouting nonsense as far as I was concerned, I sat at a table with two mathematicians, Burton Voorhees and something Antonelli. And they've stopped coming to ISSS, unfortunately. But they said, you know, Len, you used the word wrong. And I said, what? What do you mean? They said, you've made a noun out of isomorphy.
Right.
And it's really
That's
an
what I'm
adjective.
saying.
Yes, that's what the founders did, is they said things are isomorphic,
Right.
which is a comparison, and it's an adjective, but I was making a noun out of them.
Right.
And I said I did that purposely, but it was a good revelation to me too. And this is where you get back to Plato, because they told me that Plato said that the generals are more important than the instantiations. And I believe that too, very much. That the isomorphies existed before all of this nature, all of those leaves behind Tyler and the forest existed.
I agree.
That's why you rationalize that the world, the universe keeps spinning off systems again and again, just at different scalar levels, and they always come out the same because the isomorphs are more important than the instantiations. Yeah. And I rest my case, and I probably should get off so I don't dominate the conversation, or at least.
Well, Len, have you ever considered some shifting of terminology? Because I absolutely agree with that concern. Making a noun out of the term isomorphy is going to confuse an awful lot of people. It confused me when I first encountered it. So have you ever considered maybe, Tyler wrote about patterns, meta patterns. And meta patterns, meta meaning that there are patterns that exist across all those scales, right? And so if it were my druthers, if I could, control the world, I'd say, Len, the next time you open your mouth, say meta patterns or something like that, because it's something that is.
Unless you were God, you would have a hard time, because I won't use that other word, because it doesn't have the history that the ISSS does and the isomorphy. So I intend in the book that I think you're going to publish, which you may not publish because it disagrees with you in different instances.
No. I want you to do exactly what you want to do, and it will get published.
I will discuss that in the book. I will discuss the change in the word, but I've discussed it in several papers already, of noun to adjective and what the distinctions are and what the advantages and disadvantages of that are. Now I'll throw in Plato, which would please you, I guess. I don't know.
I'm really, I'm really interested in Tom. He has his finger up.
Yes,
and
Tom has his hand up.
I guess I'm interested. I know you have something to say, Tom, but I'm also just interested. What does this mean? What do they mean to you, these recurrent patterns that are recurring on different scales? I'm really curious about how you are thinking about this. I mean,
to be honest, I'm thinking more about modeling. My modeling fingers are twitching here. The wealth of knowledge and insight here, but it needs to be put together in a form that we can review it and update it and extend it. And
Mm.
I'm willing to give a shot on cycles since we've talked a lot about it and we have members here that are very knowledgeable about it. If you're willing to review it and give me feedback.
Yeah,
So
I think
start with something simple. I'd like to get a hold of what Len has on cycles, and I'll do a simple model on it and we can work from there.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues here is cycles like system is so very general. There's so many subtypes of it that it's very hard to deal, especially without a type of model that will allow you to do that. So it seems to me modeling is essential for something so abstract and general and with so many different details. And we're not so much arguing about terminology, but about the concepts. And there may be many different concepts of cycles. We just need to sort them out. We need a model to be able to do that. So I'll give it a shot, see where it goes.
Yeah, please do, Tom. Yeah, I'm with you on that. Len, is it possible you can share that set of slides on cycles for us?
Oh, that's 137 slides.
Well, could you PDF it perhaps? And that'll reduce its size.
On Peter Tuddenham's site, he has a place I can drop things.
Yeah.
And I could drop the ones on the 90-minute various isomorphies.
Yeah.
Some of them are a number patterns like, well, like what? Like measures of central tendency and so on.
Yeah.
And variance on that, which
specifically
with hierarchy and so on.
Yeah, specifically, I'm just after the cycles part. Yeah, if we could.
Well,
take a
the
start
other
on the cycles
advantage
part.
is the Cultura ones are me actually delivering the slides. So the slides don't have all the information on them. You know, there is the delivery of them. Although most of the time I follow the slides pretty closely.
Yeah.
One thing, Gary, in Len's slides, that he's got these on the PowerPoint. He's got these things that sort of one thing appears and next thing appears and next thing appears.
Yeah.
It's sort of he sort of made that for a PowerPoint format.
Yeah.
That's I must say is the students, they complain about that, but it keeps their mind on the next thing, and so they're following the logic of the presentation.
Right. It's
harder for them to read ahead or read behind or something like that.
Well, any comment?
Yeah. I want to make a comment about Len and his slides. One time about
oh yeah, she hates the slides.
No, I don't hate the slides. I love the slides. I just hate it that it's only slides and talks and not written. I mean, the book's right there. I mean, in those slides, it's just filling in the blanks. One time I was in Pomona, and Len was putting together a slide presentation for some isomorph. And the way he did it was he put about 30 slides on the page that you could see, right? In the PowerPoint thing. And then he started filling them in like this. He didn't fill them in sequentially. He started going like this. And all these different things, and I'm going, what is he doing? How could you do I mean, how could you put together, and in the end, he changed around a little bit, but it was sequential in the end. And I thought, that's the weirdest thing I've ever seen. I just thought I'd throw that in.
She just had to say I was weird one more time.
It was just really quite interesting.
Len, here's a proposal, very specific, and probably could be done very quickly. We do monographs as well. And so you could do expand your slides on cycles, explain cycles, a brief description of why you call them isomorphies, or it's isomorphic across scales, all of that kind of stuff. But something less than 200 pages, right? But expand those slides, and we could get that into production very, very quickly. If you'll just sit down and write it.
Well, actually editing takes a long time. And I could take all of the slides for all those dozen or so 90-minute things and I could make them into a transcript very quickly and then edit the transcript, which is much easier because Tuddenham's been doing that with me lately. He's been giving me transcripts of what I said, and then I edit those, and it's much easier to start from, you know, having a transcript already, but they're quite mistaken. I don't realize how much I gab and do personal things in talks. But boy, when I did the Bertalanffy one, did you guys see the Bertalanffy one, the
Yeah.
long form and the short form?
Yeah.
Boy, was I able to edit out a lot of stuff. I reduced it by a third, and then when I added all my pictures, I expanded it to even greater than it was before. However, I did cite all the Mobus books and the Volk books in that. Gary Smith
Thanks,
and
Len.
Tom Marzoff don't write anything, so
They just do real work.
yeah.
Well, look,
George, a question to you, but I really like this idea of yours of getting Len to try to write this up. But I also see that maybe the transcript way is maybe a better way, a quicker way for him to go. But what about the fact of that his first characteristic of cycles, these stages, we've agreed is problematic.
well,
I mean, but it has to be redefined, something along the lines of what you were doing in terms of, you know, state space recurrence or something like that.
Sure. But what I want him to do is get all this stuff done. We can always critique later. We can have responses. We can write papers that say, here's what Len Troncalli said, but we think this is an issue or something of that nature. But let's have that in the realm of public discourse as compared to worrying about, you know, what we're talking about right now. I just want this guy to produce some work that will go on long after the slides are, you know, digital dust.
Because I felt there are gems in that cycles PowerPoint, which
Yeah.
I wish I
Yeah.
could sort of be at a lecture and sort of, you know, question review step by
But I
step.
think what George is saying, if we produce it in a form, then what you could do is take the places where you disagree and improve it. And you could praise the pieces that you like, and then we're heading toward integration.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay, so if you had the transcript of your cycles lecture, then you just transcript it. Then you just edit it and put it up in a monograph.
Exactly.
Right.
And then it would be a series of work. And that works better, George, than the book I was going to do for you, which was on systems processes theory, the other theory of everything. And the reason it's better is that it's in small sets.
Right.
And you can't put all of those in chapters or it would be too big a book.
In fact, let's call it the Len Troncalli series on isomorphies.
Yeah, except for those first two names, because I don't want to be blamed for everything.
Or you could call
Well, your
it,
name's going to be on it, but I've got to tell the publisher that we're going to do this series of monographs. And,
Okay.
on systems processes, and start the beginning with the first one should be on the hypotheses of the systems processes theory, those 20 hypotheses or so. that you
Tenets or
listed.
so on, yeah. Well, the
tenets,
book
whatever you
will
call them.
go over that. So
But you could do that in a monograph really easily. I mean, that's a simple, I could do that. I mean, it's super simple.
so
for
we'll
you.
just assign it to you, Lynn.
No, I'm writing a book. It's a bitch. It's killing me. It's
Keep
killing
you out
me.
of trouble, though.
Oh,
it's up to you what you want to do, but I think you're right. That's what I had in mind. These small incremental steps, and once you get in the rhythm of it, you're going to find that you can produce
I
these.
basically already have a dozen 90-minute lectures.
It's right. It's all there.
There
That's what
already.
George and Lynn are saying. It's all there.
it's there already.
Wow.
And Peter transcribed already for you, right? So you already have that system
No,
down.
he transcribed my naval postgraduate school lectures, which were at the request of Kristen Gianmarco, were only half-hour presentations of SPT to begin with.
How did he
She
do
wanted
it?
a series of 5 modules that she could use at other different places in her lecture.
How did he transcribe them? What did he use?
He used an automated thing he has.
Yeah.
And it was kind of sloppy. There's a lot of mistakes in it, but that's fine too. It gives me something to work on. Anyway, I'll implement your stuff, but you guys, it's almost 10 o'clock and I have to do something for my wife or she'll kill me. And
Gary did have one thing to say. I don't know if that you want Len still there, Gary.
I do. So let me explain one of the reasons why I'd like you to send me the slide set that you just have on cycles. Yeah. So as some of you know, I'm now the senior editor for the Systems Engineering Body of Knowledge, Section 2, System Foundations. And I just want to share my screen and give you a little bit of an overview of that. So this is supported by INCOSE, the IEE, and Stevens Institute of Technology. And this is essentially it is the systems engineering body of knowledge. It's the deeper representation of systems engineering that goes well beyond what they define in their systems engineering handbook. And there's a section which is Foundations of Systems Engineering. And they have system fundamentals, system approaches applied to engineered systems, system science, systems thinking, and representing systems with models. So I'm now responsible for all of this part, yeah. And when you look at system science, it's really thin and not very good at all, yeah. So I've done some analysis of the overall thing, and I know that there's a huge amount of integration and reformatting and a load of extra stuff that needs to be put in. What I'm intending to do is this is the existing structure, yeah. And where we've got system science, you know, currently we've just got history of system science and systems approaches. I'm going to basically blow this up and expand on it greatly. This is essentially what I'm aiming to do. So there's these 2 dimensions we need to recognize, and you know, there's the data and disorder, information and concepts, frameworks for orientation, principles for practice, and assets and expertise. So this is the stages and phases of engagement with systems. And then there's the categories of knowledge about systems. So here there's different categories, but one of them I think is going to be something like cycles and the phases of systems. And what I want to do here is I want to capture, first of all, you know, an overview of the cycles isomorph, and then go into the different features of that isomorph, and then look at the different types of frameworks that relate to cycles, like Panarchy, ODA, Plan, Do, Check, Act, the Arholon cycle, and you know, there are many other different types of frameworks that take advantage of this particular isomorphy. Then we can go into the principles, and I saw in your presentation, Len, a load of stuff which are essentially, from my perspective, principles that relate to cycles, and then we have cycle assets. So how in our real world do we take advantage of this isomorph in, for instance, our systems engineering? So we have life cycle management tools and techniques, for instance. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to take all of your stuff and put it into here and provide links to perhaps certain parts of your talk, yeah, and also take advantage of all the references that I saw that you'd made in your presentation as well, yeah. And if Tom can also capture this in his UML model and make links to that to you know, that database you've been creating, Tom, then we can also reference to that. So you know, what we can do is byte by byte, isomorphy by isomorphy, fill out this knowledge about systems in terms of the isomorphies and how they relate to the foundations for systems engineering and systems approaches.
Wow.
So that's my ambition.
Wow.
And we can reference Lynn's book as well when it comes out.
When and if it comes out.
I mean, again, that Gary, that sort of iterates one advantage of focusing some on cycles, because everyone gets it to some extent, but to show that there is a sort of meta science here, because we actually go into it deeply enough. I think it's a cool idea. It's that you already were thinking of that as cycles. I guess how to get Len's PowerPoint. I mean, Len keeps saying I can't send anything over 6 meg. I mean, I know when I send through NYU, I think they don't want things over 20, but then they'll put it into people's Google Docs or something, and you can. I mean, but Len seems really limited. You keep saying you're a university, you can only send things 6 meg.
Well, my IT department corrected that. If I use not MacMail, it's MacMail that's limiting me. It's not the university. I can send something of 20 megabytes.
Yeah.
If I use, but I don't know how to use their university server. So that's my fault, Tyler. And in any case, I will put the cycle slide, as Gary is requesting, immediately on Peter Tuddenham's, because I have it right here on my desktop.
Because the one time
I'll put it on Peter Tuddenham's Dropbox, and then all you have to do is get the URL from him. He just sent me a URL that's like 12 lines long. I don't like those. If you do a right click on the file, it will memorize for you or save to your memory a short URL that goes directly to the file. And he hasn't done that yet for me and for any of my stuff.
Because the one time you sent out an email to us and you said, here, I attached the short paper on the clustering strategies, which I want to compliment you on, just thinking in those terms, various strategies for clustering. I won't, not so much for the alphabetic idea, but that's just as a joke.
Oh yeah, I understand the alphabet since.
Yeah, and it doesn't give you, yes, but it is one possibility, right? Alphabetic, like an encyclopedia.
Well, it's very useful because you can go directly to it. That's the way it's organized on my website.
Yeah.
Although I haven't put.
But the stuff about function, the stuff about by the USSO or Grand Sequence, or different clustering possibilities, it's really, I think that's a useful direction for us to think about. But to get back to the question of getting your cycles thing up, you sent something out, you said here's the short version, not of cycles, short version of the clustering, the long version's on Peter's site, Dropbox, and here's a link. But when I clicked on it, nothing happened. I think we have to be put onto those Dropbox things as having access to it. I think.
Oh,
I didn't
know that.
Yeah, I think.
I'll talk to Peter about that after this.
Does anybody know that?
I have to separate myself from the discussion because now you've given me several tasks to do.
I think. Don't you have Dropbox?
I have Dropbox, and they just charged me $300 because I expanded my Dropbox, but I must say I don't know how to use it.
Oh.
Are you zipping your files to make them smaller?
A lot of money.
Am I what?
Using zip to make your files smaller?
I've tried that before, but it doesn't make it much smaller. And I also have trouble with .pdf because I have Adobe on the computer here. But what I need is a little genie on my right shoulder, which would be like an angel, who tells me. James Martin says that I'm technologically handicapped.
They're called executive assistants, but they cost money.
Yeah, and I don't have money. So.
Secretaries.
And I think Gary was saying if you're in your PowerPoint and you save as, you could try save as PDF.
Yeah.
And see what it because
Yeah. No.
Gary, I don't know what's going to happen when he saves as PDF to all those. I think it's not going to
Animations.
the
Yeah.
combination.
no.
Yeah.
I think it's not going to.
No.
It's not
No.
going to save each iteration. It's going to save the final one or something.
Yeah,
or-
it will show the overall picture.
which is all we need. We don't need. We're not listening to an oral lecture.
No.
So
It
try
might,
that.
It might work okay. Yeah, just save it as a PDF, and you can even reduce the format, and then you can turn it, a 60 meg file into a couple of meg.
Oh, it says export. And then it goes to my PDF file, which is not available on my desktop. Oh, I'm just going to cancel that and put it on Peter Tuddenham's
Okay.
Dropbox, and I'll ask him to send it to you. Okay.
Yeah.
And I now have sent the short form and the long form with the examples, and the long form is on the in the Dropbox, and I have the URL that all you have to do is click on it and it gives it to you. And I'll send that to you next, okay?
Okay.
I'm
great.
signing off, you guys. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Len.
Thanks for showing up.
Yes, it's
Oh, yes.
appreciated.
There was some question about that, and then George said you have to, and
And
so I
thanks
filled
for
out.
finally saying some things, Len. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh. Bye, everybody, and keep safe, everyone.
Oh, good weekend. Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, that was good. So Lynn, you started off with being bothered by all these things. How do you feel now?
Well, when I
Bothered by cycles. So
I'm bothered by cycles right off the top. Here's his list, and right off the top you go, well, what about stages? That was the first one. Captain. I went, see, I mean, I find cycles annoying, and by the way, I really like George. I've been falling back to a couple of things, thanks to you, which have made my writing even more difficult in some ways, but
Happy to serve.
yeah, thanks a lot. State space. State space is an enormously useful concept for describing so many things, I think now Len has phase space and states as actually an isomorph, or as a pattern, which is kind of weird. I don't get how that really. I can't quite. Listen, maybe we won't even go.
By his own admission, though, he just sort of has listed a whole bunch of things he thinks are isomorphic. Eventually, we're going to pare that list down, because by his own definition of what an isomorphy is, I don't see how some of those things fit.
Yeah. Well, believe me, I've gone through that list with him. Luke and I went through the list one time and said, okay, give me a brief definition of each one of them and how it's an isomer. And we eliminated like 30 of them right off the top.
Yeah.
Right off the top.
Yeah.
Because it's really easy to throw them in. It's another thing to actually list them. Yeah. On the other hand, what we are listening to is somebody who has for literally probably 50 years read every single week of Nature and Science magazine. Not anymore. I don't know if he's still doing it. And every week read every article and underlined the processes that he saw in each of those articles, tore them out and threw them in a box. So it was before things were seen as, we're seeing networks now and seeing feedback and all those things throughout everything. Well, he was seeing all these things throughout everything long before everybody else was. It's hard to even, now I can write what I'm writing because I can look it up. I can just Google, cycles. It's right. I can Google self-organization. You couldn't do that 20 years ago. And 30 years ago, most of the words didn't even exist.
Yeah.
and he was listening to stuff. So so he's got he's pulling from a, a a level of understanding or experience with these things that we don't have. I mean, most people just do not have.
Mhm.
Now, George, you've certainly been around, and Tyler, you know, you guys have really been around in sciences and crossed over from biology into social systems and deeply, and that's your strength. So he just happened to have been looking at it from this particular perspective for a very long time.
And that's why I wanted to get his cycle stuff and go through it, because
Exactly.
I'm into it, and I'd like to see the gems and take out what I see as chaff. But you know, in a peer review, in an isomorph
That'd be really nice.
peer review kind of way. George, about this, since Lynn brought up the state space thing and liking that, I noticed that I sometimes call this property space. I mean, I understand the like state space in a power plant or something, but like a temperature pressure diagram, or
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
but how do you feel about the word property space? Is that
It gets at a point I was going to bring up to Lynn, to be careful when you start talking about state spaces, because you also have to identify the parameters
mhm.
of what constitutes a state. And I've heard people say there are an infinite number of things you could identify. So that has to be, it's sort of a caveat in the sense that the state space you're talking about has to be clearly identified in terms of that. And properties may be in that same sense. That when you identify which properties you're talking about, those are the ones you're going to measure.
Right.
So going back to the butterfly life cycle example, because it's like a third grade example we all know, but since it's an important cycle, how would you, in your language or in your dynamical systems language, without saying that the butterfly is tens of billions of cells that go down to molecules,
Right.
it can be defined in a reductionist way of physics. The reality is that butterfly flying around, so it sort of means something as a whole,
Right.
right? And so so the property space that what I was saying earlier, that the life cycle of this creature is going through, of these, of egg, caterpillar, chrysalis, and butterfly, that that at these different stages the creature has a certain look. I mean, you're right, we have to define the properties that we're talking about. Does it come down to words that we define the caterpillar? Yeah, Lynn, what
First of all, I have a real problem with the word life cycle, and looking at what you just described is development.
okay.
Is development. And a life cycle is a term that we use all the time, but is it really a cycle in the way that we see cycles like the moon going around the earth?
No.
I see what we're looking at is the development of the butterfly. Now that could be that I can define easily as sure, the development happens over and over with butterflies, but that's again,
it's a developmental cycle.
is that a cycle?
Well,
That's a word we use.
It's a cycle for the germline. That's what I was saying before, that
Mhm.
the the single cell fertilized cell that then develops and becomes the various stages along the way, but ultimately gives rise again to a single fertilized cell, or many of them.
Okay,
so
so that is where the cycle is. is it
That's the way I would interpret it. Yeah.
the cycle part is when reproduction is involved.
Yes.
I wouldn't. Well,
If you don't, by the way, reproduction is never on his list too. That was something I was just thinking.
Well, it has to be more than one. You can only define it if it's more than one generation. I mean, with one generation, it's just the life development,
Right.
Birth to death. If it's just one generation, it's birth to death.
mm,
But
Well,
like the monarch, for example, the monarchs that are so famous. Sorry if you're hearing yard noise. I hope it's not too loud. With the monarchs, I'll bring it up because it's so famous. They're down in Mexico. They fly up, I think, to maybe Arkansas. They lay eggs. Those butterflies fly to North Carolina. It goes through the life cycle. They fly up to New Hampshire. And so what's amazing about the monarch is when the migration cycle returns to Mexico, it's not the same butterfly that left Mexico. And in fact, they say it's 3 or 4 generations later. That's what blows the biologist's mind. How do they know to go back to Mexico? It's not even it's not a bird that taught. So that's a different thing. So within this migration cycle, there's 4 life cycles, and I don't see any way around the word cycle fitting there because biologists use it all the time.
so,
Well, I'm trying to define. Oh, sorry.
So it relates to state space, but I said in my chapter that I was using the word property space. The cycle in property space, I have to call it up here, would be anything, any value or dimension, but I didn't try to define, George, sorry, what a value or dimension are. I just threw it out. But something you can logically hold on to. I mean, by logic, I mean humans' mental doing classification and saying, yeah, this butterfly is the same stage of that species life cycle as 60 days earlier was. Now, the universe did not repeat exactly, and I agree. There's problems trying to be a plate, trying to define this. I grapple with this. I haven't worked this out. What does it mean when the property space is something that by logic I mean that we're going to define through human classification that does not need to be mathematized necessarily? I'd love if somebody has some response to this issue I just threw out. That there's something there because Lynn, biologists are obviously talking about this stuff.
Yeah, obviously.
And
I'm
I
just
mean,
talking about making it an isomorphy as part of the cycle is the same kind of cycle.
Is the problem because then it has to be defined, and Tom needs a definition that's going to.
You know, it's okay. It's okay that the butterfly produces,
it's
eggs,
Well, Tom, how does this fit into your modeling if it's not? Gary has something to say too.
So the life cycle of an individual butterfly, is the egg, the caterpillar, the chrysalis, the butterfly. That is its life cycle. Yeah, every system, every product goes through a life cycle, a life cycle. I go through a life cycle. You go through a life cycle. You have an instantiation. You have an inception. You develop. You mature. You decline, and you die. Every system goes through that.
But we call that a cycle, but that's more like development. It's a cycle when it goes back to the beginning. Now, if you're going back to the beginning,
I'm not saying one instantiation of a life cycle is a cycle. Yeah, it's just the term that we give to that overall being. Yeah.
Right.
It may well be that after you've been, there will be you know, something else which comes behind you that follows that same life cycle.
And
Yeah, so-
the relevance is that to biology is that it's not just one.
Yes, it's many.
It's the germline. I mean, you could call it going haploid diploid phases, George, or something. You could say that the chromosomes go to from haploid diploid, like kind of that's the binary oscillation again.
Mhm.
I mean, clearly this is so vital to biology.
Of course.
But another issue that I really like some feedback on are the cycles in biology. I mean, I really like to go into the biological ones because we have to talk about function, and so some of these cycles that are inside, let's say, a cell, that we can talk about the functions to the continuation of life of that cell. I mean, just for the cell to continue being as it is, stable, in a stable state space, it's got to be having ATP, ADP energy cycles going on inside it, just to maintain in time in a state space. Now, I'm going to contrast the cycles, like say chemical cycles inside a cell with the carbon cycle, which one cannot, it's harder to talk about function. You can do it in a loose way, but it's more of an assembly from organisms in geochemistry, atmosphere, ocean, carbon going in and out of different forms. It won't be the same logic to talk about. So it's sort of an inadvertent cycle versus cycles that are, one can argue, an evolutionary function for. So that would be classifying. That would be a way of clustering types of cycles. I didn't do that in my chapter. I would do it now because with the combogenesis idea, one could look at how cycles come in. How did the nature of the cycle change from quarks to culture? That would be something that I would be interested in, you know. So I'm just throwing that out as an avenue, or if there's any immediate thoughts of something that could be evolved versus inadvertent might be a separation. I mean, George, you think about these things.
I think what's
Yeah.
interesting is when you unpick this concept into things like life cycle and recycle, you know, what does that actually mean? Yeah, because, you know, life cycle for me, now I understand, life cycle is the life of one cycle. Yeah. And recycling is reusing the ended product in another recreation. That's recycling. So we use the term cycle, but we put a little bit on the front of it or at the end of it, and we use that isomorphy in a particular context. It's just interesting for me, you know, when you start to unpick these things, and like you were saying, Tyler, when you start to think about cycle in the context of combogenesis, what new piece of information and knowledge does that give us? I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, can I talk on a slightly different level here of, I guess, insights I've gotten from modeling? You often start with saying, what should the definition of something be? So what does cycle mean? And once you start talking about it, you find out there's multiple definitions of cycle, but there's multiple concepts. And I think instead of trying to say what should cycle mean, you should define what are the concepts that are important to us here.
Continue, Tom. I'm not, but I don't follow that thing that you just said. But it seems really important to me.
Different ideas of what a cycle, or we've identified different ways that a cycle could be defined. I think we need to think of those as different concepts. Then the issue at the end is, what should we call, once we have a coherent set of definitions of related concepts, and what should their names be? Now the problem here is their names have to be qualified. If you can't just call them all cycles because they're different types of cycles, different specializations. You have to decide on what the names are that fit with the whole coherent set, because coherent is a property of the whole. Then the issue becomes, this is not going, they're not all going to match with what's used other places. I think you have to recognize you can't make it match every other place because they're not coherent. So then you come to the conclusion you are defining your own language. It's sort of like the Linnaean structure, where they have the dual Latin names for species, which doesn't cause a problem with anything else. So we need to have our own set of names and get away from the idea that we have to match what already exists in multiple disciplines, which you can't possibly do. Now you can have a translation from one to the other. So for example, there's a Latin name for the Linnaean name for dog, but in German it's der Hund, in English it's dog. So you still use the common ones, but you know if you want something that's coherent across the whole set of species, you can go to the Linnaean and see that. So what I hear us doing is talking about all these possible definitions for cycles, and that's very valuable because we're making different kinds of distinctions. So what it boils down to is, what distinctions do we want to make? And again, I see us doing that through a model. So we start with, okay, cycle, what's one definition? What's another definition? What's another definition? How are these definitions related? Often they're at different levels of generality. So you can put them into a generalization, specialization, subtypes, for example, or maybe supertypes. You find out there's something more general than any of the generalizations you already have. You have to go through this process, and eventually you come up with a set of coherent definitions that are useful for going forward. And it needs to satisfy the requirement that I think Len mentioned, that it can be easily updated, improved, and extended. So it needs to be what I think of as a perfectible system, which is an idea that comes from ACOG. So what you need is a model that's perfectible, that can be continuously updated, that allows you to go through this process, capturing this information and organizing it, and eventually get it into an organization that's coherent and active, and then base that on, go forward with that. So it's a process that goes on indefinitely, which is a lot like science. It's been going on for hundreds of years and still hasn't reached the end. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah. Yep.
Yes, that sounds really, really good. And it reminds me, in my cycles chapter, I bring up the scientific method as a cycle. Of course, it's idealized, but I would like to suggest that science as a process, partly what made it so powerful was formalizing to some degree some cyclic method of making progress in knowledge. And Tom, that's what,
carry on, Tyler.
and Tom, so what you were saying about the perfectibility was just in a bigger sense was the scientific method. And if you're all interested in the chapter, you can go toward the end. I have a long quote from Robert Hooke, who lived at the same time as Newton, one of the early statements of the scientific method. And Tom, you might be interested in Hooke's description of setting out your definitions and your rules for making the experiment. Anyway, it goes through, and Hooke was very aware that this was going to be a cyclic method for getting at knowledge.
Yeah, I think that goes back to Francis Bacon, right? Even earlier.
Of who again?
Bacon?
Bacon. I think Bacon maybe, that would be great. If Bacon also was explicit about, yes, in his Novum Organum or something, Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, yes.
I bet Bacon did have a cyclic concept of how to make knowledge progress through an application of a cycle.
Yeah, not so much cyclic, but the scientific method.
Hmm.
Um, I want to bring up something because I've been kind of bothered by.
Oh, and yeah, okay. Gary was sharing a screen.
No,
But,
that's okay. I was just showing you the cycle of system science.
okay.
Yeah. So the use of the word cycle, and Lynn, I agree, it's problematic. It will remain so. So let me offer the following thing. Going back to the notion that things are isomorphic rather than isomorphies per se, which Len will never accept. Nevertheless, what we're talking about, I think, is a repetition of patterns
Mm.
where we have to be careful and identify various kinds of constraints we put on both the repetition part, but also what patterns we're talking about. So a pattern may be an exact replication of something that came before, or it can be just have some similarities.
Mm.
So if we're insisting that everything is a cycle or everything has cycles in them, and then we get into this definitional problem that Tom's bringing up, I don't see that as being very productive, and it's not at the core of what we really are talking about. So
Actually,
we have a dynamical system that produces repetition of various constrained patterns. Would be the simplest definition I can think of.
Say that again, George, please.
Yeah, a dynamical system that goes through a repetition of patterns, which are described by state spaces of some kind.
Yeah.
well, I'll tell you what. This is how I've learned to think. When I look at a pattern or isomorph or whatever you want to call it, systems process, I look for definitions, just like Tom said, look for definitions. And then look for examples, out there. And then try to identify the features of those things, not the principles, not the concepts, but the features. What actually describes these things? When I get into principles and concepts, I was listening to principles and concepts the entire time I was with the NEXI conference last week. Principles and concepts can be debated all over the place. I mean, everything can be debated, but they're messy. When I look at an actual pattern and the features and the functions, the state space, how they operate in the state space, and I define those things, then I get some clarification. When people are talking about concepts and principles, then things get a little fuzzy and weird, and then they're debating over principles and concepts. I want to debate about or identify features and functions. That I can, like George just described, repetition. He got to the heart of it, repetition of patterns. Constraints, described by state spaces. Those are features that those aren't just concepts and principles. Those are actual features of this pattern that I can find in other things
How do you
that
feel
are identifiable.
How do you feel about distinctions? I always thought they were very fundamental.
Distinctions are I think distinctions among isomorphs are extremely important. And then you start, they all interact with each other. It's difficult to unless you define each one of them and with features and functions, then it's very hard to make distinctions among the ones and to show how they interact with each other. I found when I was listening to these quite complex, very scientific and very technical presentations, sometimes they'd say things and I'd just go, I don't know anything about your particular thing. You guys are experts about whatever you're describing, but I do know this, that you guys missed something here, something big. And it's because I have this background, this very generalist background that they don't have. So they're going to miss stuff. They're going to miss stuff in their, yeah. Sorry, Gary. Yeah.
No, that's great, Lynn. So we believe it or not, we've been at this for 2 hours. Yeah. So I think it's time to start closing, because I need to go and have dinner. So I've got another meeting, and so is George in a little while.
Yeah.
Why don't we just take it in turns and say anything that comes to mind in terms of how this has gone, and what are your reflections? Who'd like to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think we're getting somewhere. We still have some terminological problems that are going to need to get sorted out, but having the idea that there's this one phenomena that we can sort of focus in on and note that there are distinctions and note that there are definitional problems and notes on, but basically, for me anyway, it's kind of come together in sort of recognizing what I would call the essence, Lynn, of what we're talking about. So I'm very thrilled with how this whole thing has gone, and I'll be really thrilled if Lynn follows up and gets his stuff written. Okay.
Thanks, George. Who'd like to go next?
Well, I basically second what George just said. I think if we continue the route, the cycle, because it's relatively simple. There are a lot of examples. Len has it as an isomorph. He's done a lot of work on it. Lynn's writing on it. George has a lot of knowledge of dynamical systems, and I've written a chapter on it. Principles of system science. And I think it would help. I think it would help all our individual work. That is maybe not cycles itself, but all our work if we used cycles as a way to hammer out some of the issues that we're talking about. What is there with this phenomenon that seems to be at multiple scales? Are we living in some kind of dream world that because language is fooling us by using the same word? I don't think so. I think there's
yeah.
I don't think so. That's enough for now. I think it's great. Second, elaborate second of what George just said.
Thanks, Tyler. Who's next?
I'll tell you what I'll do in the next month is I'm talking to Peter on Tuesday morning. So I'll talk to Peter about getting the transcriptions done. How's that?
Great.
He'll be game. We'll do that.
Good.
And then frankly, when the transcriptions are done, I sat down and did I edited his short thing, but I didn't know Peter was already doing it, editing his short Burton Lunthy talk. I took like 40 minutes, edited the whole thing and sent a copy to him, It's not that, for me, it's not that difficult to hammer out some editing. So I've got enough of my own personal editing and I'm spinning on it, but man, would it be worth it to get that sucker out, George? Thanks for yeah. And I really like focusing on isomorph at a time, the ontogenesis, combogenesis, all that discussion. That was a discussion of an isomorph. That takes you somewhere. Cycles, it takes us somewhere into the big picture and the smaller pictures. It's really good. I really like those focuses.
Mm.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. Tom?
Okay, as I said, I'll model cycles what I have so far, which will be very basic and primitive, but it will be a start and it will be a perfectible model that we can improve. Not so much because cycles is the most important thing, but because we have such a wealth of knowledge about them that it just cries out to be integrated and unified. And I think we could do that. So it might provide an example of what can be done with this type of model. I'd also like to apologize for not responding to a number of people. I have several things that I need to respond to, and I've just been sidetracked recently. I haven't been able to do it, but I will respond at some point.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. There's only so much you can do. I think we all know that. So we all did what we can. So I'm going to, if I can get hold of Len's material, I will actually start trying to create a couple of pages as a candidate starting point to add on to the SE book for that introductory page on cycles. And I'll make use of also the stuff you've sent as well, Tyler. I'm sure I've only skimmed through it, but there's lots of really interesting stuff in there. And of course, George has got several references to cycles in his book as well. And you haven't got round to cycles yet, Lynn, but maybe the stuff I do might be useful, you know, as some contribution to what you're doing in terms of the handbook as well. Right. But thanks a lot for coming in. I think it's been great.
Yeah.
I'll put this onto YouTube and I'll share it again as usual.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Great.
For everybody.
Thanks,
Peace,
Gary.
everyone.
Thanks, Gary, for running
Thank
this.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
See you
no
again
kidding.
soon.
Thank
Right.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.